Well, a very good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's debate. My name is Jonathan Ayling. I am the Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this fourth debate in our 2023 series. At the Free Speech Union, we believe firmly in the value and importance of debate, where truth is found through openly weighing and testing ideas. Yet New Zealanders feel more and more unable to have that debate, or to hear competing opinions in an increasingly segregated intellectual environment. Far too often nowadays we find that proponents exist on one side, opponents exist on the other, and never shall the two meet. We recently conducted polling at the Free Speech Union which showed that 75% of Kiwi adults believe that free speech is a defining cultural value. Yet, when asked how many of these people found free speech to be under attack, over a majority said that it was threatened in New Zealand. Decades ago, Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady of the United States, made the claim that the clash of ideas is the very sound of freedom. And we believe this still to be true today. And this may sound like an uncontroversial claim, especially if a vast majority of Kiwis believe in free speech. Yet according to the 2023 Academic Freedom Survey, which the Free Speech Union runs every year, a majority of academics at our 8 universities believed that they were unable to test received wisdom or state controversial or unpopular opinions. And it occurs to me, if the very people who have dedicated their careers to exploring specific subjects, if they are the ones who feel unfree to voice their opinions, if they are unpopular or controversial, how can these conversations move forward? I believe that popular and uncontroversial perspectives are simply not going to cut it. And that's why, inspired by events like the Monk Debates in Canada, the Free Speech Union has organised this 4-part series over 6 weeks, where the principle of free speech, the philosophical concept, if you like, can take a practical form, and we can see the practice through the exchange of differing thoughts and perspectives. But tonight you are not just invited into a passive experience. You get to have your say too. You see here a QR code, and for those who are joining us online on your screens, that you can scan with the camera function on your phone. This will prompt you to follow a link where you can participate in tonight's polling for the moots. #NoDebate. Some conversations are just too harmful. You will be asked whether you agree with the moots and whether you are willing to change your mind. As we conclude tonight, you will be asked to poll again, and at that point we will declare the winners of tonight's debate, not based on the popular support they have, but on how many minds they've changed, so we can see the persuasive value of free speech. It's a great pleasure tonight to be joined by, Josie Pagani, who wears many different hats, an incredible commentator she is, but of course a staff columnist and a political commentator. She'll be running us through tonight's event. So thank you, Josie.
Kia ora tātou whanaunga. Good to see everybody here. Welcome to everybody in the audience, but also those watching online. And very much looking forward to this debate tonight. So I thought just before we start, I want to remind you what Jonathan just said, that it's really important to vote, and you can do it through the scan the QR code there. Do that beforehand, and then we'll be able to test, you see, at the end, whether or not you've changed your mind. And that will be deciding who the winner is, because whichever side, the negative or the affirmative, who has managed to change the most minds will win the debate. So it is really important that you vote. And look, I think this is so important now in this election campaign that we're having a debate on free speech, because often the most important things, like global poverty, hot wars and cold wars, a hot war in Ukraine, a cold war between China and the US, free speech, these things don't get talked about in election campaigns. Instead, we debate who won or lost a TV debate, who looks best in a pirate outfit, and who eats the most sausage rolls, and so on. So this is really important. And the moot, just to remind you, be it resolved, no debate, some discussion will only cause harm. Do you agree with that statement? or do you disagree with that statement? And I just want you to consider, before I invite the participants on stage, two quotes that you'll be familiar with. One is, words are not violence, violence is violence. And that's true, surely that's true. But another quote, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. That's not true, because words do hurt. And those of us who believe in free speech have to accept that we believe in it because words are so important. And if we think that words are so important and the freedom to express your opinions is so important, then we have to accept also that there is harm that can be caused. So these are two interesting, almost juxtaposed quotes that I want you to consider as you decide which side of the fence you sit. If I can invite the panellists to come on stage, please. We have Simon Wilson, who needs no introduction. He's a senior writer at the New Zealand Herald, former editor of Metro, of course, Cuisine, Consumer Magazines, also an author of a book, The Home Ground, The Story of a Building That Changed Lives. Welcome, Simon. And on the... Thank you. Simon is arguing in the affirmative for the moot, and also joining him is Damian Sycamore, who is the Auckland Central candidate for the Opportunities Party. Welcome, Damian. He has had a real job as well, which will reassure many of you. He was working in a leadership team of a K-Road-based construction software startup quite recently, I think.
Last 5 years. Yep.
Good. And in the negative camp, we have first Dr. David Bromell, who is a senior research fellow at the School of Government at Vic University, specialises in applied political theory, uses political philosophy to make sense of the hard issues. Perfect skills for tonight. Thank you, David. And finally, we have Professor Holly Lawford-Smith, who has joined us from Melbourne. She's also specialising in political philosophy, Associate Professor at the University of Melbourne. She's on the editorial board of the Journal of Controversial Ideas. Again, perfectly suited for tonight's debate. Thank you. All right, we have an animated crowd here, guys. So let me just... I've reminded you to vote, so now you can vote, right? Beforehand, you've got a set view. You've come to this debate. Presumably, you've come with an opinion of your own, so go ahead and vote. And if these guys can persuade you to change your mind, because in the end, politics is about persuasion and passion. Believe it or not, this election campaign might be proving us wrong about that, but it's true. And I just want to explain the format very briefly, and then we'll get straight into it. So we're going to do 5 minutes from each of the panellists here in an order, and then we'll stick to that order and do 2.5 minutes rebuttal. So there'll be a chance for each side to rebut the arguments of the other side. Then we're going to have half an hour of debate, which will be really fun. And I encourage you, please, to again use the QR code to send in your questions, and they will pop up to me here, and I'll read them out, as many as I can get through. So, without further ado, let us begin. I'm going to invite, first of all, for the first opening statement for 5 minutes, Simon Wilson. Please start.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. You'll hear from us tonight about road safety and the Bible and the terrible things done by our schools. Plato may come up, also the terrors of the online world and mahouts and their elephants. We'll cover fascism, of course, and babies getting thrown out with the bathwater. We may also burst into a round of vicious swearing, directed at them and at you, because, you know, if our arguments fail, we reckon we could cause a lot of harm by calling everyone a fuckwit. Free speech has to be for bozos like me, right? Or it isn't free. But I heard the response. I saw what you did there. You refused to be upset in case you proved the moot that free speech can cause harm. Very clever. Okay, I suppose you're expecting a deeper argument. The underlying idea of the moot is that the truth will set you free. It's in the Bible, and it's New Testament, so more likely to be true. Jesus said it, and the sometimes reliable John wrote it down. The truth will set you free. It can never be wrong to speak out. It's the liberation doctrine called out against tyrants everywhere. The truth will set you free is also the motto of half the Catholic universities in the world, and the CIA, and Jair Bolsonaro, that COVID denier, tyrant of the Brazilian people, the rainforest destroyer and defender of free speech. You may perhaps see where I'm going with this. The truth will set you free is also a doctrine of oppression, because as Bolsonaro, the Jesuits and even the CIA know, in an unjust society, free speech, as wielded by those in charge, means insisting that the powerful can say whatever they like. It is an essential component of their tyranny. The fact is, oppressors gonna oppress, and they're going to do it to your right to speak out, your right to economic security, your right to opportunity and to better yourself, your right to personal safety. Maybe they'll pretend to be on the side of ordinary people. Maybe they won't even bother to pretend. Free speech is not the fulcrum on which it all turns. In a brutal society, violence is the fulcrum. And in a benevolent society such as our own, where everything is geared to reinforcing your existing social position, so the poor stay poor and the rich get richer, the fulcrum isn't violence. That last resort is rarely used. The fulcrum is education. Despite our belief that education is the key to getting ahead, it's not true for most people. School, for most people in New Zealand, reinforces our social and economic position in life. The marginalised remain marginalised. The people from functional families, that's most of us, become functional ourselves, and the powerful learn how to remain powerful and form the friendships that will help them to do so. This is the entire purpose of so-called elite schools, especially private schools. And it happens despite all the free speech in the world. In fact, and this is the reason I raise this, it happens while some people, perhaps our esteemed opponents will be among them, maintain in a flurry of free speech that we should look away from the role of education in perpetuating injustice and believe instead that the true crisis in education is something else, that people aren't allowed to just say whatever they like. Compared to the systemic abuse of true power in society, it feels trivial. Free speech, in that sense, is a sideshow. And free speech causes harm. I came to this debate fresh from writing about a new policy announced this week by one of our major political parties. It's called Accelerate New Zealand, and I mention it because it is such a good example of the harm that free speech can do. Accelerate New Zealand will kill people. It proposes to return speed limits on our roads to where they were before the transport agencies started to reduce them on dangerous roads. We know the speed reduction policy works. Since 2020 in Auckland, it has led to 30% fewer deaths on the roads where it's been introduced, compared to a rise of 9% elsewhere. The road safety debate is characterised by several things, and here are 5. Vigour. People get really angry. Ubiquity. When it flares up, it's everywhere. 3. A lack of restrictions. No one gets cancelled for saying stupid things or smart things. On the contrary, buffoons like Greg Murphy, who are famous, have their voices amplified. 4, there are facts. Road safety has been intensely studied worldwide, and the results are both consistent and clear. Speed does kill. 5, there is a phenomenon prominent in the world road safety debate, although by no means confined to it. The facts, for a lot of people, just don't matter. Road safety debates are free speech in all its glory. All we can do is trust to the marketplace of ideas and go at it as compellingly as we are able. But hang on, this is a public safety issue. Deaths and serious injuries on our roads are not a natural condition of life. New Zealand has the 4th or 5th, and I'm sorry I don't know which, worst record in the world. All that free speech people use to oppose speed reductions on dangerous roads is helping to kill people. I know. The negatives will probably want to hang this debate on that little word only. speech only causes, what is it? What's the moot here? Only causing harm.
Whatever it is, you've got like literally seconds to...
Because of, and look, I'm right there at the end. Because of free speech, I am standing here right now and telling you some unharmful things. So it's not only harm that is caused by free speech, I'm causing not harm. Maybe everyone will listen to me and no one will listen to Greg Murphy, and therefore good has come of this after all. It doesn't work like that. More to the point, it doesn't matter. The harm is caused. That's what's important. It's not an abstract debate. People die. Thank you.
I think that's the first time I've heard speed limits and freedom of speech in the same sentence. Congratulations on connecting those two. I would now like to invite Holly Lawford-Smith for the first opening statement from the negative side.
Okay, I'm going to make 4 points. First, no debate is a weapon wielded by people who cannot argue their side. The public philosopher Peter Boghossian put it well recently when he said, if you have evidence for a belief, you don't need anything to buttress it. Unfalsifiable beliefs and toxic ideologies insulate themselves from criticism and exposure with blasphemy laws, whether those are official laws enforced by the state or softer forms of sanction held in place by social norms. No debate is the tactic of a people who are fearful that if their position is rigorously assessed, it will become evident to all concerned that there is no justification for it. People who are really on the right side of history do not refuse to debate. They do not make imperious moral claims about how participating in debate with their opponents would only serve to legitimize their opponents' views. If the side in any dispute that weaponizes no debate were right, whether as a matter of what the evidence supports, or as a matter of what our values support, they would be able to offer that evidence and articulate those values. This is to say, they would be able to make their arguments in a public forum and allow the public to be persuaded by the force of the better argument. The no debate strategy relies upon a veneer of moral righteousness to hide its dogmatism and its refusal to be democratically accountable. It's not just no debate. It's no debate because debate would harm. So no debate is suddenly transformed from something rationally bad, forming our beliefs on the basis of another person's mere assertion, to something morally good, avoiding doing harm. My second point is about that alleged moral good. The mood for this debate is not #no debate, some discussions will cause harm. Rather, the moot is #no debate, some discussions will only cause harm. That means the burden is on our opponents to establish that for any given topic, debate will cause harm and nothing else. But that claim is false. Debate may cause harm. That depends crucially on how expansive a concept of harm we plug into our understanding of the moot and which topic we're considering debating. But it never causes only harm. Debate is an exercise of freedom of expression and freedom of thought. Debate can satisfy curiosity and cure ignorance. Debate can cause relief and create community and solidarity. I've been wondering about that too. Thank God I'm not the only one who found that reasoning unsatisfactory. Aha, that's what the response is to that question. So even when the topic being debated is outdated, stereotypical, hurtful, or offensive, there will still be all these benefits. I think it is probably almost never true, and perhaps it is never true, that a discussion only causes harm. Third point, ideas are not viruses. It's true that they can spread, and it's true that the explanation of why they spread goes beyond their merely being true. But it's not remotely plausible that they need to be quarantined for fear of contagion. And no debate is quarantine. And that is elitist and condescending. It treats you, the people, as though you're not smart enough to recognize poor reasoning and a lack of evidence, and as though you don't have the moral compass to reject ideas that don't sit well with your values. Name-calling is a form of no debate. Australians do not need to be told that voting no on the upcoming referendum on a voice to Parliament is racist. They need to be presented with the best case for supporting the voice. My fourth and final point is that no debate is not just for topics you don't like and don't want to hear about. When we endorse particular tactics and standards for political discourse, we endorse them in general. That's the social contract. Either we as a society are for debate, even on sensitive and controversial topics, or we as a society are not for debate. Politics is a pendulum and it will always swing back. So if you're a leftist comfortably asserting no debate to achieve a forced consensus on all your favourite topics, you'll do well to keep in mind that you're licensing a future in which you will be shut down and silenced in favour of a forced consensus by the right. And I would prefer that none of us are shut down and there is no forced consensus. That's why I think we should all stand against no debate, whether our preferred positions are backed by the current government or not.
And that was an argument for free speech under 5 minutes. Well done, Holly. And now back to the negative side. Damian, your opening statement. Positive side.
Affirmative.
Positive, negative. Yeah. I find those words offensive because it's not really that negative. But anyway. Nevertheless. Positive. Damian, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Josie. Hello, my name is Damian Sycamore. Last week, there was a post on the Waiheke Community Notice Board. It's a Facebook group. The post included a photo of a very sad-looking dog turning around to look at the photographer. And the caption was, "Came across this pup on Tahi Road. She has infected eyes. If anyone recognises her, she needs a vet ASAP." The dog did have some very sad-looking eyes. The first comment was... And it's gone all the way to the bottom. Excellent work. The first comment, within a minute, was, "Ooh, that's bad. Those eyes have been inflamed for some time, judging by that thickened skin. The nictating membrane shouldn't be visible or red like that." Immediately after the first comment, there was a second. "Maybe contact Island Vets to see if they know who the owner is. Those eyes look so painful." And the third comment was, "Oh my God, she needs care right now. How can anyone let that happen? Poor girl." The fourth comment, this all happened within 5 minutes of the post, was, "I'm the owner. She is recovering from $2,000 worth of eye surgery. Stitches came out yesterday. She's shaken them off. She's shaken her cone off and run off." To explain what's going on here, I'm going to rely on an analogy for how our brains work from a preeminent social psychologist called Jonathan Haidt. The rider and the elephant, hoot and the elephant. The rider is our controlled processes, including reasoning and why, and the elephant is our automatic processes, our intuitions. When we see, hear, or encounter anything, our brain processes countlessly and rapidly. The elephant begins to move, and being larger and stronger than the rider, it begins to move the rider too. The first commenter on that post saw inflamed eyes and a lost dog, and its elephant was outraged. It wanted others to be outraged. It wanted to amplify the outrage. Their rider adds to the gruesomeness of this photo of the dog by saying that the animal has been in pain for some time, despite having no evidence that that had happened. Subsequent commentators read that scientific sounding, the nictating membrane, remember that bit? Explanation about pet neglect, and their elephants are off too. There is now a herd of elephants rumbling on. The riders on top have no time to ask questions. The elephants are on their way. They want their riders focused on what's coming, not asking questions about why we started moving in the first place. Tonight I'm arguing that some discussions only cause harm. That is, that some debates don't advance towards truth or enlightenment or mind-changing. They just cause harm. And my argument is this, threefold. One, most of our discussions in 2023 happen in an environment that is totally impossible for open-minded thought. That is the internet, particularly social media. Two, most of the discussions that happen in that closed mind-inducing environment antagonise other people's elephants. That's why we're always on the defensive. And three, the arguments we have on social media close us down when we're having those same arguments offline. Tonight, we're offline. We're in a free speech union debate. We've got lots of eyes and lots of ears. And we're all aware of each other. And our social brains want to appear appealing and reasonable. You're all letting me continue to speak, but it's not a passive politeness. All of your brains are frantically trying to classify whether I'm friend or foe, whether I'm on your team or not on your team. And as yet, I haven't made it clear which team I'm on. Phil Tetlock, a leading researcher into accountability, says that in social scenarios, people act like intuitive politicians striving to maintain appealing moral identities in front of their audience. But it's not just me that's got an audience. All of you guys have the audience too, all of each other. Tetlock's theories come from his research where he asks his subjects to read about a legal case and then come to a decision or make a judgment. Half of the people he asks this of, he says that they're going to have to explain their decision-making process later. The other half he doesn't. It probably comes as no surprise that the ones who are going to have to defend their decision-making process later take a lot longer to make that decision in the first place. They think systematically and self-critically, and they are more likely to revise their own worldview in light of evidence. Those who are not don't do any of that. They rely on gut instinct and make quick judgments. Online, on social media, that reciprocal accountability, that needing to defend your argument, is optional at best and non-existent at worst. Online, we see something new or confusing, and our elephant starts moving, and we see a comment, and our elephant continues to rumble on, absolutely sure that it's made the right decision. Basically, our brains haven't evolved to have nuanced and deep responses to complex, layered scenarios, three-dimensionalising themselves out of our phone 4 times every 10 seconds. But critically, and this is the main point of my argument, the online environment occludes ourselves in the real world too. These negative cycles that start online form grooves in our brain. The under-evaluated positions become our positions by repetition and preterition. That is, the fact that we didn't evaluate them in the first place
Wrap it up, Damian.
reifies them. I'm not saying that epiphanies have ended, but I am saying that if you're trying to find them on social media, it's going to be like eating soup with a fork.
Well done. Very good. Dogs, elephants, and eating soup with a fork. Very good. And finally, on the negative side, we have Dr. David Bromell. Over to you.
Josie. Meanwhile, back to the actual moot. Some discussions will only cause harm. And I want to begin by conceding that as individuals, of course we're wise to avoid certain discussions in a range of social and professional contexts. I'm thinking of that old saying that it's best to avoid talking about sex, politics and religion in polite social conversation. At extended family gatherings, most families have someone like an Uncle Barry or an Auntie Joan, and you just know to avoid certain subjects and not get them started. We exercise discretion because we're family. We live and we let live. And likewise in professional settings. When I worked in the public service, a code of conduct reminded me to keep my politics out of my job and my job out of my politics. When I'm at work, I do not want to hear about my colleagues' sex lives. And while I might be curious about their religious beliefs and practices, or lack of them, those conversations are irrelevant and inappropriate in the workplace. Bringing your entire self to work is an entirely stupid idea. So, yes, of course, some discussions are better avoided. And in a range of social and professional settings, we are wise to exercise a certain reticence and respect for privacy with civility and common sense. But our moot this evening intends something entirely different. #no debate. Someone or some social elite, perhaps with the backing of state authority, intends to shut down public discussion on topics they think will only cause harm. Any such proposal is mistaken and dangerous, and I want to make 2 points for now. First, what do we mean by harm? International and domestic law on the right to freedom of opinion and expression draws a line at inciting others to act out violence, hostility or discrimination, and rightly so. But demanding or imposing social protection from disagreement, criticism, offence or hurt feelings does not meet that high bar. In a free and open society, discussion, debate and disagreement do me no actual harm given existing legal protections against incitement. Yes, words can hurt, but they do not hurt in the same way or to the same extent as sticks and stones, knives, bullets and bombs. And my second point is who gets to decide what we may and may not talk about. I'm arguing for individual freedom and responsibility to make that judgment for ourselves within our social and professional settings. But our moot implies, I think, an intention by some to impose no debate on others. Zero tolerance of discussion, dissent and disagreement. Trying to control what people say is in effect trying to control what people think. And it's a short step from banning ideas to banishing people, to cancel culture and deplatforming, from that is a bad idea to you are a bad person. It was George Santayana who said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, I don't want my granddaughter to grow up in a world where we repeat our awful history of crusades and inquisitions, heresy trials and witch hunts, pogroms, gulags and cultural revolutions. And nor do I want to cheat myself of opportunities to learn, grow and change my mind. If I participate in a sensorial campaign of no debate and place my current ideas and beliefs beyond criticism and correction, beyond even discussion, I'm asserting something that only the papacy has ever been cheeky enough to claim: infallibility. Because what if I'm wrong? I have been in the past. Discussion, disagreement and debate correct errors in our thinking. The search for truth is an ongoing social enterprise in which there is no fixed and final knowledge, no settled science, and no ultimate authority. That's why prohibiting discussion and shutting down debate is mistaken and dangerous. It will only take us backwards.
Thanks, David. Okay, well, we've got the yin and yang of the freedom of speech debate now. We're going to do rebuttals. You've each got 2.5 minutes, and please keep it to 2.5 minutes. We're a bit over time now, and then we'll get into a debate. So we're going to go in the same order, 2.5 minutes. Simon, how do you rebut that?
Thank you, Josie. No debate. Some discussion will only cause harm. It's a spring-loaded topic, isn't it? Much of the debate about free speech arises from marginalised people trying to do something about the systemic ways in which they are marginalised. And I was struck when David quoted somebody saying, discussion and debate do me no actual harm. They do me no actual harm, David, and they do you no actual harm, but there are people who they do harm to. Holly talked about no debate, and both of them, in fact, talked about no debate in the sense of debate being shut down and being harder to debate topics now. We actually live in a great cacophony of debate. There has never been a larger babble of ideas and information and misinformation all around us at all times. It is more biblical than the Bible. It's simply not true to say that debates are suppressed and we don't have them in our society. We have them all the time. Holly asked, what debates cause only harm? And I would suggest the road safety one I suggested before does that. Perhaps only isn't quite the issue, but the harm it causes is the point. And you can think of more easily. The truth will obviously cause harm in personal situations, in relationships, as David was saying, with children, with vulnerable people who do not need to know when the truth is awful. And it's also obviously true in the general cut and thrust of daily life. My broader family contains a number of conspiracy theorists, and I can tell you we do not debate it. Someone would have to upend the Christmas table. Most of the complaints about threats to free speech come from people who are not used to having their complacency threatened. It's just a joke. I didn't mean any harm. Stop victimising yourself. Suck it up, sunshine. If you're offended, I'm sorry, but I should be able to say what I like, or the edifice of civilization will collapse. It's my right, it's my right, it's my right. That's what marginalised people are upset about.
Thank you, Simon. Holly, rebuttal.
Okay, let me do high-speed version in case I run out of time, and then I'll elaborate if I can. To Simon, free speech can be important without being the most important thing. To Damian, you have at most established no debate online, but that was not the moot. Okay, let me say more to Simon now. So if I understood his argument correctly, it was education is the big problem because that's what perpetuates class privilege, therefore free speech is a sideshow. So this is the usual argument that if there's a really important thing, then nothing else matters. And maybe that would be nice if we could all agree as a society on exactly our priorities for what's morally important or what's unjust, and then all work together to tick off the most urgent things all in a row until we got up to the thing that's the right thing in the order. But I think there's a bunch of reasons not to do that. One, we won't agree. Two, all injustice is important, actually, I think. And three, we are free. So I like the model where each of us can choose what we care about. We can pick a social justice cause. We can pick something that's important to us or speaks to us for some personal reasons, and we can do our best to fight for that. So we're not debating the moot. Free speech is the only cause that matters. It doesn't matter if it's a sideshow to some really important thing, like the indoctrination of education or the way that education perpetuates class privilege. It just doesn't matter. All we need to show is that free speech is valuable, and shutting it down through no debate tactics is bad. And I think it is valuable, and shutting it down through no debate tactics is bad. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly. Damian, 2.5 minutes.
Thanks.
No animals.
No, ooh, Jesus.
Yeah, I'm banning animals.
I'm going to have to put all these back in the pocket. Damn.
It's too emotive.
So the moot very clearly is some discussions will only cause harm. It doesn't clarify whether those discussions are topics of debate or whether they can only happen in certain environments, or whether there's some other dimension that I'm not even paying attention to. The only thing that Simon and I need to prove is that some discussions only cause harm. And I think it's very, very clear that certain discussions in certain environments do only cause harm. And what both of our interlocutors are relying on is this old rationalist perspective, the sort of thing that the old Greek boys, the Platos and Socrates, would have loved, because they believed that God gave us reason, and as long as we could subdue the passions, we could think really clearly and lucidly about whatever was thrown at us. But we know that nowadays we just fundamentally know that that is not how our brains work. The modern understanding of brains, from social psychology and evolutionary psychology and even moral psychology, shows us that our brains don't have valves that you can turn off and on. Everything is knitted together and overlapping. When we see information, 99% of our brain is responding to it in an automatic way. And I know that that is jarring to hear because so much of what we do and think is verbalised. But that verbal cognition is only happening right at the very top, and it's used to justify the automatic processes underlying it. Fortunately, most of our automatic processes are all very aligned. That's why largely we get on. That's what we've been evolved to do, to get on with each other. But the brain is not contiguous bits. We do need to be able to shut off some of these debates from happening because they simply cause harm when reason has been totally taken out of the place.
Thank you, Damian. And finally, Dr. David.
Thank you, Josie. I realise from the audience's perspective I'm standing centre-right, but from where I stand I'm centre-left. And I want to begin by saying, Simon, I think, in fact, I share many of your concerns for oppression and injustice. You spoke about education. I would also speak about housing and equal access to well-funded healthcare. What your argument didn't show is how shutting down public discussion and debate is going to address oppression and injustice. It may not be, you talked about free speech as a sideshow, but you haven't convinced me that inhibiting discussion and debate is going to do anything to lessen oppression and injustice. Damian, I was very entertained by your herd of elephants rampaging on Waiheke Island over a visually impaired dog. And I follow what you're saying about, it goes back to David Hume, and Jonathan Haidt has argued it very powerfully, that moral reasons are the tail wagged by the intuitive dog. I'm with you on that. But again, what you haven't demonstrated to us is how shutting down discussion does anything more than leave us arguing within echo chambers like a pack of rabid dogs. So again, you're not convincing me that censorship and the suppression of discussion and debate, at least on some topics, is going to solve our tribalism, our tendency to seek out echo chambers, and these closed-mind environments that you spoke about of social media in particular.
Thanks, David. Okay. Excellent to and fro. Okay, so now we're going to get into some questions and see some of your questions coming through. But let me start with you, Simon. So you mentioned the fact that free speech is the purview of the powerful. And yet, isn't it true that history tells us that it's minorities who have needed their speech protected because the powerful always have their speech protected? So is not your argument completely round the wrong way? Suffragettes, civil rights movements, slavery. Slavery would not have survived free speech.
My point was, I completely agree with you. My point is to argue that the clarion call of free speech is appropriated by the powerful, always in society. It's appropriated in tyranny, societies which are tyrannous, by those in power to directly oppress others. I have the right to do this because I'm the powerful or because I've found a way to say that you're bad, wrong, evil, etc., and out you go. So whether it's witches in medieval England or whether it's Bolsonaro or whatever it is, that will happen. That's true. That's all I was trying to say in regard to that. It doesn't follow that free speech. It follows from that to me that free speech isn't a right that exists above society. And if we look at non-tyrannous societies like our own, free speech is powerfully commandeered by people who are themselves powerful, but not powerful in the way of a dictator. Powerful because the resources and the values of society are geared to making them comfortable. And that's people like me.
David, is free speech a principle that sits above society? Simon thinks it isn't.
I'd want to think about, so what's the counterfactual there? is the answer to restrict and qualify free speech? Or is it a democratisation of free speech, above all through education?
Oh, for me.
Yeah.
You want to do both, don't you? You want the exchange of ideas. I mean, part of our argument here is that we have a full and frank and wildly boisterous exchange of ideas in our society all the time. You all have a device in your pocket that gives you immediate access to it, not only to read it and look at it, but to participate in it. This is enormously new in the history of civilization. And it means that free speech is guaranteed to everybody, because we can just keep on doing that stuff. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily lead to healthy outcomes, but in itself it exists, and therefore we need to keep debating how we use it so we move society forward. It's not easy. It's very, very complex.
Damian, define the harm you think is caused, apart from the dog?
Yeah, harm's pretty straightforward. I think there's a number of really emotional debates that I think Gen Z are particularly concerned with. This is identity politics. One of the reasons why it's taken me a little while to sort of put my hand up and get into politics is it's a big responsibility to get up and represent a community or represent a community's views nowadays, because there's a huge plurality of those views, and getting your head around that plurality, that sort of, that massiveness takes a long time. I'm 35 now. I probably look about 45 because this campaign's been intense. But what harm looks like after, and I'm looking forward to the closing statements, because there's a reason why social media is pervasive now.
Define the harm.
Harm comes from, I'm going to use
Not from,
one specifically.
what is the harm?
Harm looks like when your whole existence is negated.
Can I give you an example?
That's harm. So we can have intellectual discussions about what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. But if your existence, if the way that you see yourself is denied, that's about as harmful as it gets. That's more violent than violence.
Oh, is it?
What?
Is it, Holly?
Absolutely not. This move that your side tends to make of using the word existence when you mean identity, and then that allowing you this rhetoric of violence and genocide.
I agree with
dishonest.
that.
It's really
But when that identity isn't yet allowed to properly exist,
What
when
does
it's
that mean?
when it's inchoate and still struggling for
It's supported
existence.
in every law in this country.
Is it?
It's got
What's
the powerful are backing that.
The
and
46
you're
different
calling it-
rainbow community identities are all in law, are they? They already
You
exist.
have self-ID.
We've got 46 bathrooms.
So
Is that how
let
that
me
works?
let me
What
butt
do you
in
do for
here,
sex here?
because now you're having a discussion about identity, which
Yes,
is a really
not
good
existence.
discussion to
Correct.
have. But what you're saying, I think, Damien, is that you shouldn't have that discussion because it causes harm. That's
in
what you're
certain
saying.
environments,
What's the
that
harm?
discussion is only harmful.
In certain environments.
Absolutely.
So who defines harm, David? If you're going to define what is harmful speech and curtail it, do you want politicians to define it? Do you want judges to define it? Do you want community representatives to define it, or ayatollahs to define it? Who defines it?
Exactly.
Actually, not you. You. Who defines it?
My answer is you want everybody to define it. You want everybody to continue to participate in that debate. But you want it to happen in a way that isn't marginalising the people you're trying to protect with the ideas that you're trying to promote. I wanted to go back to that question about define the harm and pick up on something Holly said before, shutting down discussion won't help. When you introduced me, you said I had been the editor of Consumer magazine for many years, which is true.
And cuisine.
But the
Quite a
Consumer one is
range.
the one I want to go to, because one of the things I am proudest of in my career is editor at the time when we shut down a man called Jim Sprott, who had pernicious views about his baby mattresses. Many of you in the room will remember this man. He did an enormous amount of good work in this country, particularly around the Arthur Allen Thomas trials. He was the one who showed the police had been wrong, had falsely presented evidence. On the baby stuff, he produced a mattress that he claimed would stop cot deaths. And in the 90s in New Zealand, every time there was what we now call sudden infant death syndrome, or I think it might even have another name now, but it was popularly known as cot deaths, every time there was one on the news, and it was frequent, Jim Sprott popped up and would be interviewed on radio and on television saying, if you buy your baby one of my mattresses, it will not happen. It was bullshit. It caused enormous grief to parents who blamed themselves for not buying the mattress because they had heard about it and they hadn't done it. And we at Consumer went through a rigorous process that included very exhaustive legal dispute before we could publish to show scientifically that his mattress didn't work. And as a result of that, just let me finish, as a result of that, the media stopped interviewing Jim Sprott. His mattresses subsided and disappeared. And I want to argue that is an argument, that is a case where his freedom of speech, we shut it down through exercising our own to the public good, and I would do it over and over and over.
Now, that's not a freedom of speech issue, David, is it? It's or Holly?
Yeah, that's not. I mean, I would say you're talking about speech, and speech can harm, but that's not the moot. The moot is discussion and debate, and I would think that involves an exchange of reasons, whether it involves two parties coming together like we are doing, or it involves two platforms in the public sphere airing different views, but merely showing that speech can do harm doesn't suffice to what
So you
we're
make a
discussing.
distinction between speech and debate, do you,
Yes.
Holly?
Yes.
So isn't the issue
semantic,
there
isn't it?
more
No,
about
exchange of
regulation?
reasons.
Isn't that about regulation, not freedom of speech? Like he shouldn't be able to to say falsehoods about a
but that's not
product.
the moot.
Isn't that already protected?
I would have
David?
actually taken what happened, if I've understood your story correctly, Simon, and it's an interesting one, I would have taken it as a demonstration of the power of free speech, because you had that freedom within the media and within a consumer organisation to raise these concerns in the public sphere. He had every opportunity to counter them if you were making erroneous claims or in any way casting aspersion on his business practices or being defamatory. Free speech was working itself out in that context, and free speech won.
Well,
But quick response.
we shut him down.
Yeah.
You know, we created the conditions so that he could not any longer exercise his free speech. It went nowhere. It finished.
Damian,
to the public good.
Can I? Because one thing that challenges me about this debate is that all the arguments that you're using have been used by, for example, slave owners in the South who managed to get hate speech legislation because they found the abolitionists, yeah, not ablutions.
Very good
and the abolitionists, very offensive, that they were offensive to the white community in the South, and they had, and I will hear this exact quote from the legislation, they found it emotionally upsetting and traumatising that those who wanted to abolish slavery were running a campaign, and that the laws were duly passed to reduce the harm on the slave owner community of the South. So can you possibly write a code that limits free speech or harmful speech that is not twisted?
So the first thing I'm going to do is politely step out of the being co-opted by slave owners puddle that you sort of put me into. I don't want to be there. And I'm pretty sure there was no sort of cotton-owning plantationists that were running around saying that we're all thinking like elephants and mahouts. So I'm not sure which arguments you think that...
No, they were running the same arguments, not saying you're a slave owner. They were running the same arguments about hate speech. In other words, hate is an emotion. It's extremely difficult to write a hate speech law, if you like, that bans certain hate speech that can't then be twisted by people saying, well, no, you're offending me.
This is my point about how the powerful appropriate the cause of free speech to their own ends.
Yep. Do you see what I'm saying, Damian?
I kind of see what you're saying. I think, free speech historically has been useful. Don't get me wrong. I think
Good. Glad we. Okay. We can all agree on that.
absolutely. On free speech, I think if you take a far enough away perspective, without harm, without the actual damage that was caused by those debates, then I think the outcomes that you see, you get this kind of end of history where we're at the moment, where we've had the benefit of the Enlightenment and the scientific method and the countless burnings at the cross and all of that pain. Now, today, we live in a very different world. We live in a world where that pain can be foregrounded to us very straightforwardly. We live in a very interconnected way.
Okay. David, would you ban Mein Kampf?
Would I ban Mein Kampf, Hitler's book?
Yes.
Now or at the time?
At the time, in 1938, let's say.
No, I wouldn't. When bad ideas are circulating, I want people to see what's being said and to think through the dangers and not drive that discourse underground where it festers, let alone fall into what's sometimes called the Weimar fallacy, where the Weimar government introduced censorship laws to suppress Hitler and the nascent National Socialism movement, which by the time Hitler came to power, the Nazis then said, "Thank you very much, we'll use those laws against you lot."
Can you ask that question in a New Zealand context? Would you not Mein Kampf. Would you have banned the Christchurch murderers manifesto?
No, I wouldn't.
Can you explain why? By the same argument?
By the same argument. People need to see the nonsense that it is.
Why?
And the ugliness of it.
Who does? Why?
How many people
Why?
have Wow. 3.
You can understand what he did with the gun.
You don't understand his reasons, you don't understand why it happened, you don't understand humanity unless you let him say what he wants to say.
But let me interrupt here, because isn't it true, though, Simon, that that manifesto would have been illegal anyway because it's inciting violence?
But the argument-
So everything that the Christchurch shooter was doing was already illegal. The problem was that our SAS, our secret services, were not focused on the rise of white supremacism. Right?
That is absolutely,
it wasn't a freedom of speech issue at all.
That is absolutely true,
Yeah.
but it is a freedom of speech issue
Is it?
because it is banned.
Well, it's banned because it's inciting violence. So.
Yeah.
Well, it is
yeah.
banned, but with some qualifications. The classification office can release it to academic researchers who apply on good grounds to look at it.
Don't have a problem with that, but it's banned so that people who would take succour from that horrendous event and want to build a movement from it, because there are lots of those people.
So threats of violence, threats of violence, defamation, these things are already banned under law. So what has that actually got to do with freedom? There is protected speech and unprotected speech,
But I'm
right?
sorry, there are people in the crowd saying it shouldn't be banned.
But but that was already banned. So you think that, that would be banned because it's illegal, because it's inciting violence, right? Your point, I think, is that you wouldn't ban an obnoxious and awful political ideology like Mein Kampf, for example. And Holly, do you want to come in here? In 1938, students exiled from Germany to the US tried desperately to get Mein Kampf published into English so that people would be warned about what Hitler was about to do.
I'd argue
so
for
I think,
that.
yeah.
I would argue for that. It's a time, place and circumstance, isn't it?
Yeah. So, Holly, let me ask you, if we can agree, and there are areas of agreement here, that words do cause harm, what is the most effective thing to do about the harm, if not to ban certain speech that causes it?
What is the most effective thing to do about the harm?
The offence, the harm, the hurt.
But do you mean where we should have we're not talking about incitement. We're talking about speech that causes what?
Well, let's take
Offence.
Damian's example of
Identity harm.
Identity.
Right.
What, if there is harm caused, what is it that you do about that harm?
Well, I think two things. One, the people who claim to be so harmed as to have their existence at threat do probably need to be a little more resilient in the discussion. And I think then the only remedy is counter-speech. And there are other marginalised groups that are not being heard at all because of these highly hyperbolic and emotional claims being made by one group. So unless it's really... I just want to say I'm not a free speech absolutist, and I don't interpret the moot as being about speech of any kind and in general, and that's not what I'm prepared to discuss here. I think we are talking about debate and discussion and exchange of reasons, and I think on that kind of topic where people's identities are at stake, that gets nowhere near the level of harm that you would want to ban, outlaw, socially sanction, or whatever any speaker involved.
David, are you a free speech absolutist?
No, because I draw the line at incitement. And I had a number of conversations with David Shanks, who was our chief censor, who in his office did put the ban on the manifesto and on the circulation of the shooter's video. And David Shanks and the classification office were acting under the law, as you said, in reference to their act. The question, I think, sometimes on a decision that had to be made in a matter of days after an horrific event, whether some of those decisions need a best before date put on them. Because that's another way of handling it.
We're going to move to the closing remarks shortly, but Damian, is there a danger here that we're sitting here having a debate about
Other people?
harm and free
And none of
speech,
them are involved
and
in
if
this
you're a
discussion.
woman in Iran, you're desperately fighting for your right for free speech?
There's a lot of things. I'm having to pull this star from this constellation down to connect up to this one. There's one of the difficulties about free speech and free speech purists is that they're always trying to categorise everything. That it's either everything's in or everything's out. Aside from what David just said, where everyone can agree, we should restrict direct incitement to violence against someone that can be proved. But one of the hard things about what I'm advocating for is that a lot of these individuals have rights to have their free speech and their conception of their harm added to the debate. And that slows things down. And it certainly probably slows down academic careers when you're looking to pump out books. But one of the things that it should be remembered that because we can see so much now, it probably does mean that we do need to be a lot more considered around what we think of as being free speech and what the purpose of that free speech is. I don't think anyone's got the answers at the moment. Social media has absolutely blown this all to bits, and our ability to just take everything in, it does need to be reassessed. And the laws that we're running with
Would
are
you ban
old.
harmful speech on social media?
Would I ban?
Yes or no?
There's no way to do it. Unfortunately, the mechanism doesn't exist. I would like to ban all harmful speech that I know causes harm on social media, but how can that be done?
Are you going to define what that is?
I can't, because
Simon,
everyone has their own individual
is
description.
free-
I'll give you a no.
Okay, but also I want you to answer this question. Do you think free speech is a luxury?
I think all right. I don't think we should be banning everything anyone can think of as harmful. I absolutely don't think that. It's a rigorous and complex issue, and it needs to be dealt with a complex solution. Free speech is not an absolute, as I've said 2 or 3 times tonight. In my view, doesn't sit above everything. Free speech exists in society, in different societies, in different ways, and therefore it's a right. Yes, of course it's a right, but like all our rights, it has limits, and the limits are determined by time, place and circumstance, and who you are and how powerful you are. It's easy to say nobody should be allowed to stand up in this room and call out fire unless it's true. Everybody knows
That's already illegal.
Yeah, that's right. But
Yeah.
we're not talking about what's already illegal. We're talking
Yeah.
about what the principles are.
Yeah.
And everybody understands that. So you work from that. You work from where are the grey areas that are really difficult to argue. And one of the big things I've tried to argue here is that because we find it pretty easy to get obsessed by the idea that, oh my gosh, somebody is stopping me from exercising my right to say whatever I like, that somehow has become a more important issue in society than the poverty and the systemic racism and other injustices that we really should be focusing on.
None of which you'd be able to fight if you didn't have freedom of speech.
I think that's
David.
a trivial answer. I think that's facile. I'm sorry.
What I want to do is move to the closing remarks where you all get a chance to rebut anything that's been said, and I want to do it in reverse order this time. And because we're running slightly out of time, I'm going to keep you to the 5 minutes exactly, so please excuse me if I sound rude. But David, would you like to do your closing remarks? And just before you start, please guys, this is the time where you can start to vote again. Like, has anybody on the panel here changed your mind? And this is how we'll work out who's won the debate. So please do vote again if your position has stayed the same or whether you've actually found that you've changed your mind. David, 5 minutes.
So, 5 reasons why I join Holly in arguing against the moot. No debate, some discussions will only cause harm. First, someone has to decide what we may and may not discuss in case it causes harm. In a pluralist democratic society, who has a monopoly on truth? The government, mainstream media, the hapless Kate Hanna and her disinformation project. Who are the high priests of woke? Who appoints them, and to whom are they accountable? My second point, censorship makes fools of us all in the long run. We look back and wonder how people could have been so superstitious, bullying and cruel during the witch trials of the early modern period. But generations to come will wonder at the pseudo-religious fundamentalisms and nastiness of identity politics and cancel culture in the 21st century. My third point is that suppressing debate, disagreement and dissent doesn't actually work. Banning ideas only drives them underground where bad ideas fester into worse ideas. The best response to bad ideas is counter-speech, not suppression and censorship. Research shows that in the short term, deplatforming from the big social media platforms does remove opportunities to monetize content. It hit Donald Trump in the pocket when he was deplatformed from social media after the insurrection at the Capitol in January 2021. But of course that effect didn't last. Trump recently raised more than $7 million selling merchandise with his police mugshot taken in Atlanta, Georgia. Fourthly, there is something off about a woke elite patronisingly championing some oppressed social group they frame in the role of victims who must be protected at all costs. And I want to speak very personally about this. As a gay man working in the church from the late 1980s through to the early 2000s, I sat through some awful discussions and debates where the criticism and the prejudice and the discrimination were directed at me. But I never wanted to be cast in the role of a victim who needed protection. I learned to build a bridge and get over it. And besides, just because I found myself in unjust situations did not mean that all my thinking and ideas were right and beyond criticism. I had to learn to play a long game. And if those difficult public debates hadn't happened back in the years before and after homosexual law reform, perhaps as a society we wouldn't have found our way to where we are now. And finally, it is mistaken and dangerous to shut down discussion and debate because it teaches our children completely the wrong lessons, to parrot current orthodoxies, to engage in virtue signalling, to shut their mouths and keep their thoughts to themselves, to suppress curiosity and critical thinking and open inquiry without which progress is impossible. There is nothing progressive about censorship and cancel culture. And of course, some topics are difficult to discuss in the public square. We won't necessarily come to agreement on them, but we might understand a little better where others are coming from. We might learn to get used to each other and to coexist, not as friends because that's asking too much, but at least as opponents rather than enemies. We need to start conversations, not shut them down. Debate is often uncomfortable and contentious, but as political philosopher Michael Sandel puts it, clamour and contention are the sound and spectacle of democracy, and free speech is and always has been our best defence against tyranny.
Thanks, David. Damian, your final 5 minutes.
Thanks. There's so much I agree with what David has just said. The outcomes are fantastic. But before I go on, I want to come back to the sore-eyed dog Facebook post. Because the next comment after the owner came in and clarified what had happened, the next comment was, all you judgmental types need to chill out. Assumptions are not good. Talk about judging a book by its cover. And it's textbook elephant and rider behaviour online. This commenter is outraged by the unfairness of the mob justice, and they need to enlist more support to show that they themselves are really just. Ironically, we think of this kind of behaviour as something other people do, and it's not something that we ourselves do. We are patient and rational. People are dumb, panicky and dangerous. The old rationalist perspective that reason will overcome and free speech must be unrestricted, that all ideas should be let out at any time, aligns with this. That's the negative of tonight's moot, that we should be able to debate everything because we each believe innately that we're ultra-reasonable and that we can keep emotions and intuitions, our elephants, out of the debate. The main argument for why that is it'll make a better functioning democracy because we need to be able to bash these ideas around, right? That talking about something and hearing about it, having a conversation, theoretically allows us to get intellectually, emotionally, and empathically closer to that conversation. But modern understandings of how the brain works show that our brains just don't work like this. You cannot force your brain to only operate dispassionately and rationally. These brain scientists go on to state that our ability to reason sophisticatedly is not because we're trying to find truth to enhance or update our worldview, but rather we use reason to enlist support for our worldview. We're not seeking truth, we're seeking trust. But, and there is a but, our brains are not dumb or unreasonable, but they can only be reasoned with in certain environments, and definitely not when they're already moving full throttle. I've tried to speak to all of you to your elephants tonight. Unfortunately, that got a little bit muddled up, and obviously you all know where I stand now, so the elephants are rampaging. But I tried to deliberately avoid saying anything that could be classified as left or right or too woke or conservative, and the reason for that is a serious one. Because Tetlock, the accountability expert that I was mentioning before, who did the study on the subjects having to explain why they made a decision, he talks about two different types of careful reasoning: exploratory thought and confirmatory thought. Confirmatory thought is what's happening almost all of the time, 99.9% of the time, where we look to validate our lives and worldview. But exploratory thought is much rarer and it's special. And it's when there's an even-handed consideration of alternative points of view. And for exploratory thought to happen, it needs to take place under four special and specific characteristics. And I think we've actually got them all here tonight. Accountability. You're expected to be asked to justify your decision-making. You guys are asked whether you're going to change your mind. 2, you're aware of that accountability requirement before you started listening. Obviously, some of you have done some research beforehand and have defined opinions, but before we started talking. You're not aware of everyone else's, the audience's views, but you are confident that the audience is intelligent and concerned with accuracy. Pinch yourself. According to Tetlock, you are in an environment conducive to exploratory thought. And I thought we were going to be here, and I'm delighted that we are. And what have I chosen to talk to you about whilst you're in this rare and special mode? That social media, where the vast majority of our discussions take place in 2023, is not designed for exploratory thought. It is not designed to allow it at all. And that critically, having the discussion on social media anyway, where our elephants are battling and we're in an ultra-defensive state, condemns our ability to possibly ever be able to have an open-minded debate on the topics that we had there. Because those social media discussions leave these grooves in our brain, social media is not designed to find truth, it's designed to maximise engagement, and it targets the known problems of democracy: triviality,
Wrap it up,
outrage,
Damian.
and factionalism. It shuts down our exploratory mode and pushes us into this defensive state. I will close. Some discussions, whether they happen online or in person, just dig deeper into these grooves. They become quagmires where no one can change their mind, and the result is always outsized, pointless, negative social harm.
Thanks, Damian. Holly, final closing comments.
Sex versus gender identity must be in the top 3, at least in wealthy countries, of topics that heavily feature no debate tactics. I can't tell you how many times over the last 6 years I've been approached by media outlets looking to host a debate between gender-critical feminism and gender identity activism, or at least to interview both sides. But I can tell you the number of times any of those ventures have succeeded. 0. There's a huge public interest in such debate and discussion, and there are platforms with the resources to make it happen. Gender-critical feminists, as a general rule, accept such invitations, and gender identity activists, as a general rule, reject them. Occasionally, you'll get a gender identity activist actually accept an invitation, everyone gets excited, but they always seem to drop out before the debate or interview actually happens, and I presume that is because of pressure from the trans activist community, who have fully committed to no debate as a tactic. I run a censorship timeline on my website, tracking the number of times I personally have been subject to some form of attempted suppression relating to my gender-critical views. It currently records 23 separate incidents. This is not just opponents refusing to discuss or debate the issues directly. It's opponents attempting to make sure one side cannot be heard at all. No debate is allegedly justified as a matter of preventing harm. We're supposed to believe that allowing the expression of gender-critical ideas will harm trans people. So we should suppress gender-critical ideas in order to prevent harm to trans people. The opposite is true. It's no debate that causes harm. If we can't debate the relative importance of sex versus gender identity, then we can't advocate for the women in prison who would be harmed by a policy that enables male offenders to identify into women's prisons. We can't defend the women who need rape and domestic violence shelters, who are harmed by policies that mean they end up sharing facilities with men because the men say they feel like women. We can't stand up for the women athletes who are harmed when they lose places in competitions because they're forced into unfair competition against those with the physical advantages built by male puberty. We can't safeguard the lesbian and autistic and tomboy girls who are not trans and who don't need medical and surgical interventions, and yet are being indoctrinated into an ideology that interprets their differences as transness. I could go on, and none of what I've said so far has begun to attempt to factor in the longer-term harms to society of indoctrinating people into pseudoscience just because it is kind, including the pseudoscience that sex is a spectrum, that there are more than 2 sexes, and that sex can be changed. Sex versus gender identity is just one debate in which one side uses no debate tactics to protect itself from scrutiny and secure unjustified political and legal gains. But it is a helpful case study in showing what no debate can do and why we should oppose it. So returning to the moot, it's true that some discussions cause harm, at least when we include emotional harm, including harm to identity. It's false that any discussion only causes harm, because all discussion and debate advances other interests too. And in many cases, those interests, for example, freedom of expression and freedom of thought, are likely to be more weighty than the harms, like emotional reactions or insecurity and self-doubt. Much more likely than some discussions only causing harm is that no debate itself causes harm, by shutting down legitimate viewpoints and securing political support by dishonest means, hiding scientific ignorance and moral dogmatism behind a false veneer of protecting the vulnerable. Let's stop enabling those tactics. Let's stand against no debate and for debate and discussion of even the most controversial ideas.
Thanks, Holly. And finally, Simon, for the final.
Thank you. Holly, I hear what you're saying there, and I hope you'll understand that I'm not going to directly talk to the issues of gender politics that you've raised. I'm not in a position to do that. I don't feel it's my place. So I don't want to do that, except I suppose I do want to say that it is my perception that it is not a false veneer that people on the other side of this debate from you have put up. I think their feelings and values are just as real as yours and just as important to them as yours. That is my perception of it. And I also want to say that in that debate, like every other debate I've ever heard and seen and taken part in my life, there are sometimes people of bad faith on both sides and very often people of good faith on both sides. And it's quite wrong to go, who are the people of bad faith? They must be the wrong ones, because it's always more complicated than that. I think if we go back to the question of go back to the moot and go back to the argument, to the point of what only causes harm, if you look at the way in which the free speech debate arose in developed countries, particularly out of America, and you look at issues like the Black Lives Matter movement, and you look at this country, you look at the way in which issues of co-governance and treaty partnerships and so on have been addressed, I think there are a bunch of other issues that we need to look at, and it doesn't help us, David, to talk about high priests of the woke and things like that. I think that trivialises the debate. Babies get thrown out with the bathwater when we trivialise the debate. What's important to most people or to marginalised people gets overwhelmed by what's important to the already privileged few. I talked about road safety in my introductory speech, but it could have been housing or the rights of immigrants or the treatment of the disabled, climate crisis, workers' rights, any number of things where injustice creates or magnifies material hardship and stunts lives. But thanks, in my view, to an orgy of free speech that we live in this world, with social media and a lot of mainstream media and everything else, the rights and preoccupations of the already privileged prevail in our civic discourse. Take for just one moment that Journal of Critical Inquiry and Enlightened Cultural Commentary, The Listener. This may surprise you. They do a lot of good work, but they also over and over and over and over tell us about brain health and living longer and smart use of money and the disease you didn't know you have and how to make your lovely home even lovelier and new cures that will change your life. And do you know what they call it? Catering to the worried well. They swamp, it's not just The Listener, it's the whole thing. Swamp the national discourse, crowd out the critical issues with hundreds of thousands of words about things that might seem to be important, but really they're not. Does unmitigated free speech do us harm? You bet it does. And there's another thing about the clarion call of free speech I do want to mention. It's become a favourite among some of the worst elements in our democracy. People who just last year wanted to hang the Prime Minister. Some of them continue to call for that to happen to many other politicians and journalists. I know this because they've told me I'm on their lists. They claim they don't have free speech, although they demonstrably do have, and cause a great deal of harm with it. The late Moana Jackson spoke about this. He said, free speech has in fact too often been misused and abused to foster a worrying climate of intolerant discontent. It is the kind of spoken violence which can lead to fascism, posing as freedom. And I know our eminent opponents will want to say a cause should not be judged by its worst supporters. And I agree with that. Free speech is a good cause. It's an important cause. And it's no less important just because terrible people abuse the term. But that's not what we're debating here. We're talking about whether some discussion will only cause harm. The fascists out there are fully intent on harm, and they use the freedoms we grant them to pursue that intent. Clearly, the moot is true. And if there's one thing in this debate that it all comes down to for me, it is the question David raised about what are we teaching our children if we don't have all the debates. One of the things I would love to think we taught our children in this country far better than we do now is that we teach all of them that the world is for them. Because right now, the way in which a lot of our children are taught is that they learn the world is not for them. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. We could just ban the listener. That might. So we've had dogs and elephants. We've had speeding limitations. We've had Uncle Bob and Auntie June. We've had we couldn't avoid identity. We've had sex, religion, politics. We have modelled free speech here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. And look, there are good and bad faith actors on all sides. I do want to say something that we have to be careful not to demonise those on either side of this debate, whether it be identity politics, whether it be freedom of speech. And don't forget, this is not a left or right issue. In America, 40% of the cases that go to court are from censorship from the right. So this isn't just about your woke high priests and priestesses. And it's important that we remember that, because a principle is a right, and a right is a right, and we have to protect it even for those that we disagree with. And finally, I would say that I wanted to quote one last quote and say that it's been a fantastic debate. I want to thank all the panellists, and I think we're agreeing on the core issues, which is that freedom of speech is crucially important. Speech can cause harm. Where we're differing is what we do about that harm. And to quote the late Christopher Hitchens, he said that free speech is the essential liberty without which all the other freedoms are either impossible to imagine or impossible to put into practice. There would be no civil rights movement, no suffragettes, no anti-poverty campaigns, no marriage equality without freedom of speech. Thank you to all the participants. Please put your hands together to thank everybody here. Thank you to you for your questions, which I abbreviated because many of them were similar and they were great questions. And I would like to invite Jonathan to reveal the poll result.
Come on. We'll put our heads.
Thank you, Josie. In the context of the election debate that is currently running, it may seem peculiar to run a debate series on issues that have nothing to do with the general election we're about to partake in. But in the context of that general election, let's keep in mind we're talking a margin of 5 to 7%, depending on what polls we listen to, that the centre-right currently has over the centre-left. Over the 4 debates that the Free Speech Union has run over the past 6 weeks, the winning teams of each debate has shifted the room by that amount. We're just filling in these final results, but each event has seen about 5 to 7% change their mind. That may not sound a lot, but it's enough in the general election to make a difference in the government. And I wonder what happens tonight if 5 to 7% have walked away with a different belief in mind. Maybe the value of persuasion will come to the fore again. The Free Speech Union stands by the majority of Kiwis who were polled earlier this year, who claim that they do feel free speech is under threat. By no means are we free speech absolutists, and I think both sides made that argument very well tonight. But we do believe that there is a shift occurring in our public discourse, and that it will not serve us well, ultimately for the fundamental reason that humans will not flourish if they are not free. Now, for those of you who are giving me knowing nods, yes, I am filling in a little bit here just while we have these final results coming.
Would you like us to sing a song?
But I will come to a close now. By a margin of 4%, Holly and David have persuaded more minds here tonight. Well done. Thank you all for coming.
All right, guys, go drink and be merry.